Hi, and thanks for clicking. In this vlog, I'm breaking away from looking at Roman kit and have finally got my hands on this. It's a hoplite shield, more commonly known as the aspis. I'll start with a quick overview of the hoplite and how he may have fought because, well, the aspis was a response to a type of warfare, so it's important to get an idea of what that type of warfare might have looked like and how the shield would have been used. And then we'll look at the shield itself, including some features of note, and finally I'll be giving it a whirl. To cap it all off, I'll be answering a few questions which people have asked under my previous preview for this and on Twitter. Our first step then, what was a hoplite? Greek warfare in the archaic and classical period was dominated by the hoplite, the heavy infantry soldier armed with spear and shield, and it's something of an iconic image. Yet there is much about the hoplite which might surprise you. Take the word hoplite, for example. It makes its debut in 470 BC and doesn't really become a standard word used by the historians until later on that century. Indeed, both Herodotus and Thucydides, writing in the 5th century, don't like using it for any military activity prior to the 5th century. It's argued that the word hoplite came from a root word meaning tools or equipment, and thus the hoplite was defined by a particular kit he wore which differed him from the rest. This has perhaps nourished the idea that the hoplite was named after his shield, the hoplon. I don't think this is the case, and so I'll be referring to the shield as the aspis rather than hoplon. But anyway, semantics over, and we can finally get into a bit more detail. Well, we'll look at two images. The first deals with the early version of the type you might meet on the field of battle around the time of the Persian Wars, and the second more at the end of the 5th century BC, where you'd have Greeks fighting, well, other Greeks. There's quite a lot to look at here, so let's take it literally from the top. The style of the helmet is known as the Corinthian, and it's quite familiar. I imagine you've seen it before. I'd love to get hold of one and actually do a vlog on it at some point. Next up is the body armour, and what isn't shown here is the bronze cuirass, which was an option, and though it provided robust protection, can't have been particularly pleasant to wear during the campaigning season, which was always in the summer. Perhaps that's why the chap here is wearing something called linothorax. We aren't exactly sure how it was made because we don't have anything surviving, but we do know that it was linen reinforced with metal plates. If you think, as I did, that it doesn't sound particularly effective, you'd be wrong. Professor Greg Aldretti has experimented and created some which works pretty well. He even tested some out against arrows and blade thrusts, and suffice to say, it stood up pretty well. Next up is the spear, which was the main offensive weapon, and the one thing the aspis would have looked to counter the most. And finally the greaves, which protect the lower leg and were clipped on. The aspis is really nicely drawn here, so we can see the different levels or components of it, and I don't want to ruin the surprises later, but you can see that there's several features and several pieces that went towards it. By the end of the 5th century BC, a fair amount had changed. The Peloponnesian War was a theatre in which the hoplite style faced different challenges, so by the end of it, things look, well, a bit different. The most striking difference is that he looks a bit more austere. Gone is the Corinthian or crested helmet, and even the linothorax isn't there anymore. Here we have something which resembles a simple infantryman. But why the change? Well, remember that the Peloponnesian War had drawn upon the resources of all the city-states participating in it. The full hoplite kit, or panoply as it's sometimes referred to, was really quite expensive. Hans van Wees estimated that only the top 3 classes in Athens would have been able to afford the more elaborate, I suppose you can call it, kit. With more of the poorer classes fighting as hoplites, perhaps this image is more indicative of what you'd have seen. There's also the chance that alternative and cheaper options were, well, as effective. Take the Corinthian style helmet, which I've mentioned is absent. It's replaced by a conical one, and the conical style protects well against spear strikes delivered from overhead, so as the war went on, perhaps the panoply, as it were, was simply evolved and developed, so that it wasn't just the old expensive items that were seen as the only option. But what hasn't changed is the nature of the hoplite as a spearman, and one who relied heavily on his shield. If we have a rough idea of what a hoplite looked like, we need to know the conditions in which they fought. This will give us some important features of the shield, which I'll pick up later. So, how did they fight? For many, the Shigi vase, dating to the middle 7th century BC, sums up neatly. 2 armies fighting in a tight formation. We refer to this as a phalanx, a term which actually makes its debut in the 4th century BC when it was coined by Xenophon. How hoplites fought exactly invokes some pretty strong opinions from scholars, which is ironic given the subject, so I'll try and stick to what's been commonly agreed. To start with, the two armies would meet at an agreed place. Hoplite battles needed large, flat terrain. The armies would then march towards each other. When close, they'd charge, although not the Spartans. The Spartans never charged. They marched in time to someone playing the aulus or double flute. In some instances, that was enough. Some battles ended up before they started with one side simply giving way or retreating. But let's assume they did clash and they met right in the middle. Now, the crux of the debate on the hoplite battle is really how tight the formation was, whether the hoplites fought in a tight press or more loosely. Most scholars agree that there was contact, what is termed as othismos, which means push or jostle. Some argue that the hoplite battle was a sort of reverse tug of war, both sides pushing the other to see who'd break first. Finally, we come to the aspis, and there's going to be a bit more shield, less me ratio, which can only, let's face it, be a good thing. The aspis you're looking at measured around 36 inches in diameter, which is roughly what we'd expect. The design itself is present on a thin copper surface, which apparently came into use around 500 BC. It's quite a technical feat. It would certainly help against arrows and reinforce for that shove when it came to the othismos. But the obvious thing you're looking at here is the image or emblem on the shield. Emblems on shields are common on Greek vases. Scorpions, snakes, all sorts of creatures, and even mythical ones like Pegasus appear on vases from before the word hoplite was even being used. If I was being awkward, I'd say something like, well, perhaps this is the vase painter just showing off. Perhaps fewer shields had designs on them, and the vases simply offered the artist a good opportunity to give some intricate detail. Well, perhaps not all shields had anything on them, and perhaps some did. Most likely it was a mix. Now take the design you're looking at on this shield. It's the lambda, a Greek letter which is said to represent the Spartans. And for many, this is an iconic shield image. Yet the lambda on a shield is not on any depiction of a hoplite I have seen, and it's not referenced by any contemporary historian. The argument for it comes from the 9th century AD writer, citing Eupolis, who lived in the 5th century BC. There's evidence for other city-states using letters on their shields, so it is possible, just not perhaps as fully evidenced as you or I might expect. Interestingly, one argument suggests that the lambda would have been used by helots fighting alongside their Spartan masters. Now, helots, in case you didn't know, were the original population which the Spartans enslaved, and when not persecuting them directly, the Spartans allowed them to fight and die alongside them. Nice. In order to mark them out, they were given shields with the lambda on them, sort of stating that they belonged to the Spartans. Now I wanted to show you the side, and just look how deep this is. It's a depth of about 5 inches, and there are two possible reasons for why this dome was there. The first is it gives the hoplite a lot of space behind the shield, and if he wants to press and shove with it, it creates that space for him. Paul Bardanius has written some really good articles on this. The idea that you could have lots of people simply shoving the guy in front is limited after a certain point, and Bardanius argues that you'd end up crushing the people in the front row. So this depth allowed the hoplite to act behind it and give him literal breathing space. It means you can have the shield out in front of you and not necessarily at an angle to the side. Worth noting too is the thickness of the dome and the support. That is a rim that goes around the outside of that dome, and I think it's yellow on the picture, and that's really thick, and that really helps support the dome. It still doesn't mean there couldn't have been haphazard pushing though. A second result is that the hoplite can have the shield right up close. The handle, which we'll see next, is almost in front of the rim, and this means its point of balance allows the shield to be held very snug and tight, and we'll see that later when I'm giving it a whirl. As promised, this is the rear of the shield, and this is, I suppose you might want to call it the engine. In the centre is the handle, or the porpax as it was known. It's a cuff which the arm slips into, and this says a lot about how the shield was used. I don't see it have much movement with this. It actually allows the shield to be fixed in one position, more so than you might think, and perhaps backs up the idea that hoplites fought in this tight formation. You can see a piece of rope running around the porpax. Its use is unclear, but Paul Bardanius argues quite nicely that this was originally a piece of rope which was tightened to reinforce the shield for the othismos or push. In time, the shield was modified, as I referred earlier, to that thickness on the side image of the dome. So this made it redundant, but it was still kept in the shield, perhaps as a decorative feature. Oddly enough, the paw packs can actually be removed, and there is a suggestion this happened a fair amount where shields were kept in temples or in public areas, because if there was a riot or uprising, and let's face it, in ancient Greece that was almost a daily occurrence, these couldn't then suddenly be used. Okay, so now we can finally have a look how the shield, or you can see how the shield looks on me. Probably quite nice, I hope. And I'll be talking to you about the various things and how it feels and that kind of stuff. So, first of all, if I can, this is going to be my first. Oh, here it is. So this is my first comment about the shield. It's heavy. I think this one weighs in at just over 10 kilograms. We don't know exactly how heavy they were because I've seen it sort of 6 kilograms. I've seen sort of 9 kilograms max. I'm not quite sure. Either way, this isn't a shield. Well, it is a shield that immediately announces to you that it's a needy shield. This thing wants to be on your shoulder. It doesn't want to be very far away from you, because when you first don't pick it up or put it on, you feel really off balance and a bit out of kilter. Now, when you actually get it close up to you, it fits quite snugly. It's on my shoulder here, so it's resting on my shoulder, which I imagine after a while would possibly start giving me a bit of a dead arm. But it's it feels good, it feels okay, and I do feel safe behind it. Now, as I said when we were looking at the rear of the shield, here we go. This is the paw packs, and here's the handle. And these two work brilliantly. There's no way you could use this shield without both of these features. And as I said, this could be removed, so you effectively can disarm the shield. Another point, which I sort of referred to earlier, about the tight or the loose formation. This shield isn't one that you can move around very easily. This isn't a shield that goes anywhere near swashbuckling. Now, I know that on vases, on some Greek vases, they have the hoplites really sort of cavorting around with these, and I do wonder if that's a bit of artistic license. I'm not so sure that in battle you'd really want to be doing this or moving it around. You just want one thing. You'd want to be behind it. And where we looked at the side of it earlier, and it gave you that depth, you can really see, or at least appreciate, when I'm behind this, there's not really much to get. It's just I suppose it's just the head, which is pretty important to you. You imagine you've got a helmet on, you've got things coming over. We do see on some vases the underhand grip, so I can imagine that if you're primarily using a spear to get over the top of this shield, you're going to tire, because it uses a particular set of muscles. The shoulders must have been very well developed. But underneath, you get the underneath shot or spear thrust. I suppose the obvious question is, or an obvious question to me, is how does this compare to the scutum, which is something I've done a vlog on, and if you get the chance, I'd suggest you just have a little look and see if you like it. It's a very different shield. It does a very different function. The irony is that this was, in many ways, a close quarter shield. So it was like the scutum in that it would be used close up and personal. And I think there's as ever for everything, there seems to be a Spartan saying, and a Spartan apparently had a life-sized fly on the front of his shield, and someone said, well, why have you got a fly? And he said, well, because in battle you'll see it up close. So the idea is, of course, these guys aren't really necessarily going to be fighting from afar. That option is obviously open to them. Like the scutum then, it's used at close quarters. Unlike the scutum, this is really only going to work in a fixed position. I've read that the hoplites would have liked to have approached with this at a slight angle. I did some side on. I imagine there's some pretty good vlogs out there which will show you this in a bit more detail. And that was just to give as much coverage as possible. But in truth, the more you hold this away from this fixed position, the more unbalanced you are, and the more tiring it is. If I'm doing that, that's okay. Again, I'm not a Greek soldier. I wasn't trained as a Greek soldier, and I dare say I'm probably a bit heavier than the average Greek soldier. But either way, the simple mechanics work that this does not like being away from people. It wants to be up close. It wants to be personal, which is quite nice. It's a very friendly shield. So the scutum and this are similar in some ways, very different in other. I wouldn't really like someone coming at me close up with a sword or anything like that, because again, the Greeks, they thought the secondary weapon was a sword, and you see a fair few vase images of them fighting with swords. So I do wonder how this would have worked with a sword, because this is not ideal. If you've got this and a sword, I'm not so sure that this would work very well with a sword, but I suppose it's a secondary weapon. It wasn't ideal, and well, they obviously knew how to use it. As I stated at the beginning, there are a couple of questions that I was asked, and I don't think I've covered particularly brilliantly in the vlog, so I want to look at these separately. And the first question is, would the materials used in the production of an aspis have been readily available in Greece? And if so, could there be a region famed for its production? Well, the aspis was made of wood, possibly willow and poplar. If you saw the first image with the shield split into sections, you might have noticed that it was probably constructed using planks and strips, and this gives the shield strength and flexibility. The only other major component is bronze, and both of these were available, so I don't think they had a particular problem with resources. As for a famed area, I couldn't find a specific reference, but I did read that Pericles, at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, invited Cephalus, a Syracusan, to set up a shield factory in Athens, in the Piraeus, in the port. It employed 120 slaves, so it was quite a substantial factory, probably the largest one in Athens. In case you didn't know, Cephalus had a son, he's called Lysias, who you may have heard about. He was a renowned speechwriter and political figure. The second question: have archaeologists ever found an original aspis? Well, yes. If you Google Hoplite Vatican shield, you'll see one which has partially survived. Of course, the danger here is that this is one example, and you can fall into the trap of thinking all the shields are the same as this one. Though they may have been similar in design, the simple fact is that many different people were making them, and therefore standardization wouldn't really have occurred. I suppose the question I have is, when did this type of shield stop being used? Well, the aspis is a specialised type of shield, and it seems that the 4th century BC, a preference for more mobile units came into play. Iphicrates, an Athenian general, was credited by some sources as doing away with the aspis and upgrading the light infantry as a sort of replacement for the hoplite. It's plausible that the Peloponnesian War was a partial catalyst for this. Through it, the hoplite was picked up and examined. One obvious weakness was the lack of adaptability the hoplite, in the traditional sense, had. So there we are. We've looked at the shield, we've looked at the hoplite, and I've given you a few thoughts and arguments to consider. As ever, I'd really like to see any comments you've got. Keep it nice and civilised. Should really have the opportunity here to, I suppose, plug myself further. I've got my website, ancientblogger.com. You can find me on Twitter at ancientblogger. Bit of a pattern there, and I've got my other vlogs on my Ancient Blogger site, obviously on YouTube here as well, and I've got podcasts as well. I'm on iTunes as Medusa Selfie, and on SoundCloud at Ancient Blogger is my name. You can find my vlogs, my podcasts, everything else on my website, so if you get the chance, just have a look round. As ever, it's a skill set I'm developing, so hopefully you'll find it roughly bearable. And until I see you next time, thanks very much for clicking, and keep safe.